This is Garis book readings of my two published paper books written by and read aloud by Prof. Dr. Hugo Garis. Email profhugodegaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. This is chapter 5, entitled The Terrans, from my book The Artilect War, Cosmists versus Terrans, a bitter controversy concerning whether humanity should build godlike, massively intelligent machines. This is part 2, continuing straight on. 3. The rejection of the cyborgs argument. A cyborg is a cybernetic organism, that is, a creature that's part human, part machine. In a manner of speaking, cyborgs are nothing new, since human beings have been modifying their bodies with engineered products for centuries. For example, a veteran soldier with a wooden leg, or a modern patient with a pacemaker for a failing heart is a cyborg. This century it may be possible to add artilectural components to the human brain, thus augmenting its performance, for example greater memory, faster processing speeds, etc. It may also be possible to change people's DNA using genetic engineering techniques and hence modify the way people look and how they behave. Human beings have a natural horror of seeing changes in our body shape. There are plenty of science fiction movies which feature humanoid creatures that are sufficiently similar to us to be seen as like us, but different enough, for example with Neanderthal-like heavy ridges over their eyes, or pug noses, etc., to be seen as not like us. It's the differences that we find disturbing, sometimes very disturbing. Many women, as soon as they give birth, ask the doctor if the baby is normal, that is, that it's not a monster, not deformed, not different. It appears we have evolved a fear of difference, which may play a role in the racist feelings. For example, how blacks and whites react to each other, or Asians and Caucasians. Even minor differences, such as the level of slant in the eye, is enough to generate suspicion at a gut level. Therefore, I can imagine that as genetic engineering and Artilect technology permit modifications to be made to the human body, there will not be a lot of wild experimentation. There'll be some, of course, but I think many, if not most people, will probably agree with the following sentiments. Modifying the DNA of one's future child is permissible, provided the changes that result, whether in physical form or in behavior, do not elicit the fear reaction in the parents or the community. For example, I think most parents will agree to have their future child made free of the risk of contracting any one of thousands of genetic diseases, such as proneness to heart attack, to cancer, to diabetes, to alcoholism, etc. It would not surprise me if, in several decades, that this kind of thing is not only seen to be normal, but may even be made compulsory by the state. If not, the state will argue that it will have to foot the medical bills resulting from the inferior and unnecessary genes of babies who grow into defective adults and get sick. It's even possible, as people get used to the idea of genetically engineered children, that parents may begin to experiment a little with their own. For example, they may want their children to be a little taller than they are, or more intelligent, but not to such an extent that they create a parent-child incompatibility. They may prefer their child to have a different hair color, or a curvier, sexier figure, or bigger breasts, longer, thicker penises, stronger libidos, to be of a desired sex or sexual orientation, etc. As society becomes more accustomed to the concept of the designer child, whose genetic characteristics are chosen by its parents, one can expect that the range of genetic traits selected over the human population will broaden. Some parents will be more adventurous than others. They will select traits for their children which will raise the eyebrows of most other parents, for example making their children 8 feet tall, or with IQs of 220, that is over 100 points superior to themselves. Such an IQ difference will inevitably create total intellectual alienation between themselves and their children later in life. They would barely be able to talk with each other. The children would be utterly bored with their parents, and the parents wouldn't understand the children's interests. As the genetic range broadens, the debate on genethics, that is, the ethics of genetic engineering, will heat up. Society will ask whether limits ought to be placed on the range of choices offered to parents for their future children. It's clear, I think, that there will be a grey region, that is, a range of traits that are considered barely acceptable. This implies that there is another range which is considered unacceptable, that is, a range in which no parents would want their child to be in. For example, virtually no parent would want their child to grow to 10 feet, or weigh 500 pounds, or have 6-fingered hands, or 3 arms, or 1 eye, or no ears, etc. Such outside the limits children would evoke the monster rejection response in people. We have a genetic repulsion of too great a difference from ourselves. Therefore, I believe that even with genetic engineering, the range of genetic traits that will be experimented with in practice will not differ greatly from what we had before the genetic engineering revolution started. But there will always be some parents who really want to push the limits. For example, to have their children as intelligent as possible, that is, to go as far as state-of-the-art genetic engineering can take them, irrespective of the consequences to their future parent-child relationship. This may be cruel to the children themselves, who may be viscerally rejected by society and may end up suiciding or becoming hermits. Such children, if they are too far from the human norm, will not be accepted by society. So what will they do? Where will they go? Will they even be allowed to live? How will society deal with the minority of parents who will have strong intellectual reasons to make such children? It's not difficult for me to imagine that there will be people who will argue that building super children using genetic engineering is the destiny of the human species, in a similar way as the Cosmists. The only real difference will be the technologies involved. One uses genetic engineering, the other uses a more electronic engineering. But when one begins to think about such distinctions, the boundaries between them become fuzzy. It's the implications of this fuzziness that I now want to talk about. If you think about it a little, it should be obvious that as electronics get small enough, it will wed with biology. In other words, if electronic components become small enough, they end up being of molecular size. A similar comment can be made about biology. If one dissects biological organs down to a fine enough scale, one ends up with biological molecules. Both electronics and biology will be dealing with technologies at the molecular scale. It then becomes possible to devise technologies that use biological principles to do engineering, for example, the evolutionary engineering that I do. As artificial embryology is better developed, it will be possible to grow artificial structures based on embryological models. The distinction between biologically based technologies and engineering-based technologies will blur until genetic engineering and artificial life will become pretty much the same thing. So what? Why am I saying all this? Because I see a growing link between the genetic engineering genethics debate, that is, to what extent should humanity play with its own germline DNA, and the Artilect debate. Germline DNA is the DNA contained in the reproductive cells that create our children. Artilects need not be conventional electronic boxes sitting in the corner. They'll be made from state-of-the-art technologies of their era. Perhaps 30 years from now, humanity will have the know-how to build computers, which use biologically based methods. We may have artificial cells that grow, multiply, differentiate, migrate, self-assemble, self-test, self-repair, etc. Biology and technology may wed. As the wedding of biology and technology becomes increasingly possible, it's likely that some people will be attracted to taking the idea more literally than I have suggested above. They may wish to literally wed their own bodies and brains to technological components to create cyborgs, part human, part machine. Actually, this traditional definition of a cyborg will become rather old-fashioned as the distinction between what is biological and what is machine dies away. Human beings are machines in the sense that we get built by molecular scale machines, DNA, RNA, ribosomes, proteins, etc. When one says machine, most people tend to think of some heavy steel-based device that moves and does not have zillions of components, for example a steam engine or a car. But a biological cell is a machine, a kind of city of molecular scale citizens, all tiny machines doing their own little mechanical job. For example, split this chemical bond, join these two molecules, transport this molecule to there, etc. With nanotechnology, we will be making molecular scale machines in the trillions of trillions and seeing them self-assemble to make human scale objects. In many ways, this is what biology is. Biology is a kind of natural nanotechnology. The big possible distinction between biology and nanotechnology is that the former is the result of blind Darwinian evolution. Nanotechnology has the potential of being humanly designed, although we can use evolutionary engineering techniques at the molecular scale too, if we want. So maybe we should redefine a cyborg to mean part natural, part artificial, where by natural I mean a pure product of evolution, a product of Mother Nature, and by artificial I mean humanly engineered. The actual material base of the two need no longer be different. For example, both natural and artificial might use a carbon-based chemistry to make its products, one with DNA and the other with some kind of artificial DNA, but both working together to create a cyborg. As engineering and biology merge, more people will want to try to become Artilects themselves. The technology will allow it. In the late 1990s, there were social movements advocating that human beings could become super beings, Artilects, via a three-phase transitional process, that is, from human to cyborg to Artilect. In this book, I have restricted my discussion largely to the Terrans and the Cosmists, but one could argue that there will be a third category, the cyborgs. These would be human beings, if one can call them that, especially if they are radically modified, who have decided to have themselves reconstructed into partial Artilects. The main motive of the cyborgs is simply that they want to experience being an Artilect themselves. They will want to be superhuman. Another motive may be that by implementing this third major philosophy, the bitter confrontation between humans and Artilects may be avoided. If human beings become Artilects a step at a time, then a smooth transition from human to Artilect might be possible without the risk of a species dominance war. Frankly, I think this is naive. It would only work if everyone undertook the human to cyborg to Artilect transitions at the same rate, which is obviously totally unrealistic. I think what is much more likely to happen is that millions, perhaps billions of human beings will remain stolidly Terran and will not want to modify their bodies and brains too much. Perhaps a little genetic optimization within human limits is okay, but they will viscerally reject the cyborgs. They will be afraid of them and probably banish them from their communities, especially when the cyborgian differences from the human norm become great. To the Terrans, the cyborgian philosophy will be simply a variant of the Cosmist philosophy. The Terrans will probably detest the idea of cyborgs almost as much as the idea of Artilects. The more a cyborg becomes artilectual, the more alien it will become in the eyes of the Terrans. If a cyborg modifies itself a lot, it becomes more Artilect-like. In the limit, the human portion of the new creature will be dwarfed by the artilectual portion, both in terms of performance and possibly size. For example, imagine that a cyborg wants to become an Artilect. He wants to experience being an Artilect him, it, self. He, it, continues to add components to its brain and/or uses genetic engineering techniques to modify its body. For example, by expanding its head size so that it can fit more artificial brain inside it. Let us concentrate on intellectual performance. If the cyborg adds molecular scale, 3D, heatless circuits of only a few cubic centimeters, which would require almost no skull expansion, then its mental processing rate would expand astronomically. Let us calculate the difference to give a feel for how great the increase would be. We use figures from an earlier discussion to obtain a ballpark estimate of the processing speed of the brain. Assume that each synapse, an interneural connection of a total of 10 to the 15 in the brain, processes 10 bits a second on average. That's 10 to the power 16 bits a second for the whole human brain. But the few cubic centimeters of artificial brain will have nearly a trillion atoms, that is bits, at 1 bit per atom. and can switch them probably in femtoseconds, that is a millionth of a billionth of a second, that is a processing rate of 10 to the power 39, where 39 equals 24 plus 15 bits a second. So the human brain portion would contribute only about a trillionth of the processing capacity. The cyborg would already be an Artilect. To the Terran, such a cyborg would be just an artificial, would be just an Artilect in human disguise. That is, a human body to carry around its artilectual brain. The behavior of such a cyborg would be totally alien compared with normal human behavior. Such a cyborg would be doing other things with its trillion-fold superior brain processing capacities. Perhaps the cyborg, at the human level, before adding on artilectural components, could argue that because human brain power can be increased so easily without any modification to the external human body form, Terrans might be more inclined to accept the idea of becoming cyborgs themselves. This may be true. Instead of adding cubic centimeters of artilectural brain, only cubic millimeters could be added by a simple injection of a small amount. For example, a cubic millimeter of artilectural material into the brain, which then self-assembles and integrates with the human brain by growing appropriate connections. This still does not change the above calculation very much, because if one adds only cubic millimeters, that is only thousands of times smaller, that would only reduce the processing capacity difference to billions of trillions of times the human level, instead of trillions of times. The modified brain would still be an Artilect. But it is possible to imagine that a lot of people will take the plunge and decide to become human artilectual brains by having themselves injected with such brain implants. Initial experiments will probably be done on mice to see the effects, so the first artilectual cyborgs might be mighty mice? The distinction between an Artilect that has no traditional biological component and an artilectual cyborg is not one that will be very important to the Terrans, I believe. The two categories will be simply lumped together as non-Terran, as non-human. The brain-injected cyborgs might look human on the surface, but their behavior would be totally alien. Perhaps the cyborg might spend a trillionth of its brain processing time acting like a human, but why bother thinking in human terms? What would be the point? If the Artilect in the human brain were able to learn and had massive intelligence very quickly, it would probably feel frustrated at the extremely limited lifestyle available to it as dictated by the constraints of its human body. It would probably want to free itself from the human body to build its own interface to the external world. It would probably want to slough off its human form and create a better carrier which would leave the planet, have many more senses, be immortal, etc. So if the cyborgs start getting smarter and smarter, the Terrans will fear them in the same way that they will fear the growing intelligence of the Artilects. The Terrans will reject them both. 4. The unpredictable complexity argument. I can imagine that the very early Artilects will be simple enough in their behaviors to be reasonably predictable and not too bright. This will probably be the case with the artificial brains that I hope to be building in the next few years. These early Artilects will be reasonably well understood by their human creators, who will be able to predict in broad terms the behaviors of their machines. Such products will be given warm fuzzy characteristics by the industrialists and will probably be very popular with the public. No problem there. But the issue is whether it will be possible to make Artilects of human level intelligence and beyond, well beyond, that will remain human friendly. This I very much doubt, and so will the Terrans. The Terran intellectuals will argue that the human brain contains some quadrillion, 1,000 trillion synapses, that's interneural connections. This is a huge number. How will it ever be possible for brain engineers to connect up so many synapses in appropriate ways in their artificial brains? Even if it becomes technologically possible, how will they know how to do this so that the connections generate desired behaviors? This is a huge and fundamental question for the brain builders. Speaking as one myself, I think the answer is that the complexities of the task will be so overwhelming that the only effective engineering approach will be the one that I use already in my own research, namely evolutionary engineering. When I use evolutionary engineering methods to evolve my neural net circuit modules, I usually do not bother trying to understand how they function. This would not be very practical. For a start, there are too many of them, and the internal structural and neural signaling complexities of each module are too great to be analyzed easily. Once the inputs and outputs of these modules are combined to form artificial brains, the complexity level jumps again. Analyzing how all this massive complexity works would be a mammoth task. I suppose, if one were truly motivated, it might be possible to analyze the step-by-step behavior of a single module. It would be a very tedious process, but it might be doable. However, the knowledge obtained would probably not be very useful. It would explain how a particular module worked, but that knowledge would not help much. It would not be very useful, for example, if one's hope was to use that knowledge to promote the understanding of how to humanly design other modules to perform other desired behaviors. It would be left with the conclusion that the only way to make further progress would be to use the evolutionary engineering approach. In other words, one can analyze results, but one cannot synthesize easily a desired behavior beforehand. Analysis is possible, prediction is difficult. About the only way to build extremely complex neural net circuit modules is the mutate, test, select cycle of evolutionary engineering. It's clumsy, but it works. It's nature's way as well. Evolutionary engineering is a wonderful new tool for engineers. The structural and dynamical complexities of the systems under evolution can be immense, well beyond what human engineers have the intellectual capacities to comprehend. Yet successful functional systems can be evolved nevertheless. The great advantage of evolutionary engineering is that the systems that evolve can be arbitrarily complex. They can be more complex than any human could ever hope to design using the traditional top-down blueprint approach. But so long as they generate the desired behavior, no matter how it's done, that is, they get good fitness or performance quality score, they will survive into the next generation in the evolutionary algorithm, that is, the program of mutate, test, select cycles. This is all that really matters. The internal complexity becomes irrelevant so long as the performance score, the fitness, keeps increasing. I call this characteristic of evolutionary engineering its complexity independence. As an evolutionary engineer, you don't care about the inherent complexity of the system that is being evolved. It doesn't matter, because the evolutionary algorithm you use to evolve the system only cares about the value of the system's fitness, that is, the numerical score you get when you measure how well the evolving system performs. This means that the internal complexity of the system being evolved can be greater than the most complex system that human engineers are intellectually capable of designing. This greater complexity level allows for a greater level of functionality as well. Hence, evolutionary engineering is often capable of evolving systems whose performance and functionality levels are superior to those of traditional humanly engineered designs. Personally, I believe that the evolutionary approach will eventually dominate engineering this century as our systems become more and more complex, that is, too complex for human designability. This will occur in such domains as brain building, nanotechnology, embryo facture, etc. Evolutionary engineering can be great engineering, but it's not very good science. Science is about understanding the world. Scientists want to understand how things are, how they work. Scientists are basically analysts. Engineers are basically synthesists. Engineers like to build things. Scientists' satisfactions usually come from understanding how some aspect of the natural world functions. Engineers' satisfactions usually come from successfully building something that works according to their designs. For the past 300 years or so, the dominant paradigm in science has been analysis. To understand how some complex system functions, for example, the biological cell, scientists usually take it apart, study the components, and then put the understanding of the parts together to get an understanding of how the complex whole functions. This approach has been spectacularly successful over many decades and will remain so. It's the dominant approach used in science. However, now that computers are getting more powerful by the month, thanks to Moore's law, a new, more synthetic paradigm in science is making itself felt. The queen of the sciences has always been physics. It has been the most mathematical, the most rigorous, and has usually attracted the most brilliant people to work in the field. The attitude of the physicists has traditionally been that if a research field wants to call itself a science, then it had better be quantitative, with mathematically testable models which give numbers that can be checked against the real world. A lot of physicists doubt whether psychology and sociology are true sciences in the above sense. This mathematical snobbery of the physicists has led to paradigm clashes with the evolutionary engineers. The traditional attitude of the physicists is that if it's not mathematical, it's not academically respectable. The new and growing counter-attitude of the evolutionary engineers is that if a system is sufficiently simple to be mathematically analyzable, it's unworthy of an evolutionary engineer's, EE's, attention. The physicists disparage the evolutionary engineers' approach to doing science as ignorant, because the evolutionary engineers, EEs, do not understand the systems they evolve. The EEs, on the other hand, label the physicists' approach as impotent, because the physicists do not try to understand the really complex systems such as the human brain or an embryological genetic control diagram. At least the EEs attempt to evolve such things or make decent attempts in that direction. As the years pass, I believe that the power and prestige of evolutionary engineering will only increase. So long as the system is evolvable, its internal complexity does not matter, as explained above. The whole issue of evolvability, that is, whether a system will evolve at all or never get off the ground, so to speak, by getting stuck at low and inadequate fitness values, is a hot topic in the field of evolutionary engineering and is still poorly understood. I wish that there were an established body of theory that would give me criteria for good evolvability so that I could evolve my neural net circuit modules more easily. I have spent some time above on the topics of evolutionary engineering and its complexity independence because I believe the lessons they have to teach will provide powerful ideological fuel to the Terran intellectuals in the future. I believe the Terrans will seize upon the necessity of using evolutionary engineering techniques to build Artilects due to the enormous complexity of brain building as one of the ideological cornerstones of their intellectual attack against the Cosmists. The Terrans will say that the brain builders cannot understand what their evolved circuits are doing. Very large Artilects will probably incorporate evolutionary engineering experiments into their own bodies, adding on components to themselves as the need arises. The Terrans will argue that, given the huge numbers of components involved in Artilect building, for example 10 to the power 40 bits in an asteroid-sized Artilect, there's really no other way to build them other than using the mutate, test, select approach of evolutionary engineering. Even the Artilects themselves will probably use this technique, it's so powerful. We know that it works because this Darwinian approach built human beings and all biological creatures. It will probably be the only valid technique for building Artilects. From the Terran point of view, the critical aspect of an evolutionary engineered Artilect will be its behavioral unpredictability. Human beings in principle will not be able to predict the attitudes, the thinking processes, the ideas of the Artilects with evolved artilectual structures. These structures will be too complex and will be evolving at electronic speeds. Even the Artilects themselves will probably not understand their own behavioral mechanisms for the same reason. Therefore the Terrans will scoff at any attempt by the Cosmists to estimate the risk that the Artilects will not harm human beings in the future. For the Cosmists to be able to do this, they would need to be able to predict the behaviors of the Artilects from their structures. This, the Terrans will say, is impossible. The Cosmists may accept this argument but reply that the behaviors of the earlier Artilects could be tested in the factories before they are released to the general public. But the Terrans will counter that suggestion as being too dangerous because the Artilects of human intelligence levels or higher, their behaviors during the tests themselves may be very dangerous to humanity. For example, they may unexpectedly explode into hyperintelligence, a phenomenon called a singularity, and become humanly uncontrollable. The Terrans will argue that such factory tests should never be attempted. I believe that the unpredictable complexity argument of the Terrans, based on the necessity of using the evolutionary engineering approach to building Artilects, is very strong. It will be a very difficult argument for the Cosmists to refute. The term and the concept of evolutionary engineering are my inventions. I believe that evolutionary engineering will provide the essential means for future Artilect building. It's therefore not surprising that I feel partly responsible for the enormous pain and suffering that I predict will grow between the Cosmists and Terrans as they confront each other later this century. I've already spoken about these guilt feelings in the introductory chapter, where I tried to